Hello everybody, and welcome to this video tutorial where we're going to be covering Selenium Webdriver, going over the basics of that, and then we're going to, in the second half of the video, go into automated QA testing. So a full rundown of what we're going over. First, we're just going to do the basics of Selenium, learn what it is, and do a quick kind of Hello World project where we're just going to make sure we have everything set up properly and that we can visit a website with Selenium. Once we've got that down, we're going to jump into a beginner project where we'll use what we've learned and we'll make a YouTube rank check bot. So our bot will go to YouTube, it'll type in a query of our choice, and then it can look at the search results pages and pull out the videos, and we can check based on channel name to see where our free code camp videos are ranking. After that, once we've gone over Selenium itself, we'll jump into how we can use Selenium for automated QA testing, and we'll go into some stuff like page object model and some concepts like that, and then finally we'll end off with a QA testing project where we'll use Selenium to kind of test or kind of do examples of how we'd test a website. In this case, we're going to do Reddit and do stuff like login, grab posts, and check if like upvote functionality is working, stuff like that. So why would you want to learn Selenium? Number one is that it's fun to use for making bots and automating stuff. So if you want to make a Twitter bot or something like Instagram where you want to get around API restrictions, you can use Selenium to do that. You could do something like if you have an item you want to buy on Amazon, you want to find out when it's on sale, you could have a bot that every hour it goes to Amazon, it grabs the price, and if it's on sale, you could then have it send you a text message or a notification of some sort. So really Selenium, it's only kind of limited by your creativity in that regard. And kind of going into the second part of our video, you could make a job of using Selenium where you could do automated QA testing. The average salary is around $90,000 a year, and it's a good spot really if you're trying to break into the tech industry. They're a little bit easier to get these jobs than like a full-blown software engineering job, so that might be something you want to look into. So with that said, let's just jump right into the code. The first thing you're going to need to make sure you do is download the WebDriver for either Chrome or Firefox. So I'll put this link in the description, but basically what you want to do is you want to check your Chrome version if that's what browser you're using. So if you go to Chrome // you can see up here version 76. So you'd want to make sure you grab that version or whichever version your browser is. If you're using Firefox, you can also just Google Gecko driver and you can find the proper version there. And then just choose that, download it for your operating system, so Windows, Mac, Linux, whichever one you're using. Once you've got that, you're going to want to make sure your programming environment is set up. I'm just using VS Code here, so I have my project folder. What you're going to make sure is that you have this Chrome driver executable inside your project folder where you're running your code. And then down here, what you want to do is, if you're using Python, you're going to do pip install Selenium, and that will bring in this client library so we can import it like this. So from Selenium, and then you want to import your WebDriver. If you're using something like Node.js, JavaScript, you'd do like npm install Selenium, and whatever the specific client library is for Node.js, you'd do the same thing. So basically you just want to make sure you have your environment properly set up so that we can run our code. And to do that, we're just going to test right now a basic kind of hello world for Selenium, which is going to be going to Google. So we're going to do driver equals, we'll do webdriver.chrome, and then we're going to instantiate that. And what this will do is give us a driver object which has a lot, basically the core features of Selenium. So we're going to do driver.get, and then we're going to pass in a string, so it's https google.com, and then we're going to do print driver.title. This will print off the title of the page we're on, and then we're just going to click save. And we're going to run this file and make sure if you have your system set up properly, we should see that it'll open up a browser window. And you see it takes a second, but then it puts in Google, and now we can see inside this automated browser we have Selenium working properly. So now that we've verified that everything's working as we would expect, let's go back to the slideshow and we'll look at some of the main stuff we can do with Selenium. So as you can see in that, we used this driver object to get a URL, and that's what you're going to use to basically visit specific websites or pages of websites. Whatever you put in there, the browser will automatically visit that website. It's like typing it into the URL bar at the top of whatever browser you're using. Next, when we're working on our YouTube bot, we'll go into find elements. This is probably one of the biggest things you're going to be working with. You can find web elements based on CSS classes, based on their ID tag, XPath, all sorts of different strategies you can use to find web elements, and I'll go over kind of which ways you should try first to save yourself time and keep things simple. In some cases, this is a more advanced feature, which is execute script. So no matter what programming language you're using with Selenium, you can always fall back to using JavaScript. You can inject JavaScript directly into the browser to either find elements or pull out some piece of text or something. If you can't, with the built-in functionality, do something, you can always use JavaScript. A little bit later, I'll also show you how when you instantiate the browser object, you can specify various arguments and options. So one example would be you can specify so that the browser runs headless. So when we just ran that a few seconds ago, you can see it opened up that window, and it can be kind of annoying if you're working on your computer. So you can specify an argument so that it runs headless, which means it basically runs in the background without that visual window popping up in the background. Once you use find elements, it will return a web element object, and then with that object you have built-in functionality to interact with it. So if you find elements to get a button object, you can click on it. If you have an input tab, like if you have an input bar like Google search bar, you can use the send keys functionality to enter text into it. You can do submit to submit the button. You can check if an object is displayed. So if something's like a modal or like a pop-up form, it might be on the page but it's not visible, so you can check for that. You can find the exact location of an element on the web page, all sorts of stuff. And later on, I'll also go into, you can do specified waits, error handling, and expected conditions. So all that we'll be learning this as we build our projects. So let's go back to our code editor and let's start on our YouTube bot. So first thing is we're going to create a new file. Let's call it rankcheck.py. I'll save that. And before I really do any Selenium project, I always try to kind of run through it just as a human, so I can get an idea of exactly what I'm trying to accomplish. So in this case, we want to type something in here, click submit, and then we're going to go to the results page. So let's do React.js tutorial, and then we'll click enter. And then we're going to want to basically grab these videos and check to see if this matches our channel name. So we're going to be looking to see where freecodecamp.org channel is ranking at. So basically the way to think about it is we're going to grab all these videos, we're going to compare each of these names against our channel name, and if it matches, we're going to return that and print off where exactly it's ranking at. So going from kind of how a human thinks about this, where we just click the button and don't really even think about what's going on, for using Selenium, what you really have to keep in mind is basically that Selenium's really dumb. We have to specify every single little thing that it has to do. In some cases, you even have to specify to wait for the page to load before it looks for an element, because you have to think there's a slight delay of a couple seconds where it loads. If you just try to grab an element before the page is loaded, you're going to get an error because it's not there yet. So it's kind of a thought process of how you deal with it, but you'll learn it over time and kind of get better with it over time. So the first thing we're going to do is open up our Chrome tools, because we need to basically figure out what the search bar is, how we're going to identify it so Selenium can find it. So if we click on that and find this ID, we can see that it has it's an input, and it has a nice little ID for us to use called search. So in a lot of cases, it's not going to be this easy. We're kind of lucky in this regard, because some websites make it so that they are deliberately, they don't want bots on their site, so they make it tough to work with. But in this case, let's go back to our editor. We're just going to grab our main, because these first couple steps are basically the same. So we're just going to copy and paste this, and we're going to change Google to YouTube. And then beneath this, what we're going to do is do search bar equals driver.find element. So we can see here all of our different options. We have find element by class name, CSS selector, ID, XPath, all these various things. And one thing to keep in mind is you also have find elements with plural. So we're going to be using these for when we have multiple elements, like on the results page where we have 20 videos. We're going to want to use this as opposed to these ones where it's only pulls a singular. If you use one of these, you'll only get the first element that matches. If you use the find elements, you'll get an entire list of every element on the page that matches. So in this case, we're going to do find element by ID, and we know that that search bar is ID of search. And then once we have this, we can do search bar dot send keys, and we can enter in whatever our search query is. In this case, let's just create a variable up here. We'll call it just query equals, and we'll do to start React.js tutorial. And we'll also want to input our channel name that we're going to be comparing against. We'll just do channel name equals string free codecamp.org. And now we're just going to pass in our query into here. And then the next thing we want to do, so we have to think about every step. So the next thing we need to do, if we go back, is once we've typed this in, we have to then find this button and click on it to get to the results page. So if we repeat our process where we want to find this element, we can see we have a button ID. We can see search, icon, legacy. So again, we can basically repeat that process where we're just going to do search button equals find element by ID, and it's search, icon, legacy. And then we have to specify, that's not enough, we have to actually click on the button so that it goes through with that. And then this is a case where we have to put a wait in here. So we're going to do import time, and we're going to just do time.sleep. We'll give it 10 seconds just for right now, because we want to, once we click on this button, we want to make sure our program waits until the next page is loaded. Otherwise, we're going to get all sorts of errors. So if we click save now and go back, now we have to find those elements on the result page. So if we click, we get our load, and now we can identify. So we're going to click, and we can see this is a case where there's a lot of nested elements, so we have to try to just find the best one. So this one, it doesn't have a ID, but if we go up We can see it has ID byline. So in a ideal situation, you're going to want to basically use ID or a CSS class. In some cases, you'll have to resort to XPath, which is kind of its own syntax for finding elements, and that can get pretty complicated. So in most cases, or whenever possible, you're going to want to use CSS classes or an ID tag. And in this case, we're getting lucky. Other websites make it a lot harder to do this. So what we're going to do is just find these elements by the ID byline. So we're going to do video list equals, and we're going to do, again, just driver.find elements. And this is what, where I was saying earlier, you have to make sure you use the elements plural. We're going to do byline. And then once we have these channels, what we're going to do, we'll check just to make sure we actually have them. So we'll do for video in video list. We'll do print video.text. And this is one of those web elements. So each of these videos is a web element that we talked about earlier, and they all have the property text. So whatever text they contain, we can access that. In this case, we're going to want to just print it off for now, just to make sure all of our stuff is working properly. But then after this runs, what we're going to want to do is basically we're going to run a comparison, say if video.text equals this, we're going to want to grab that element and print it off. So let's just see. Oops, I ran the wrong program. So I want to make sure I type in, instead of running main again, I want to do rank check.py. Hopefully all of our queries work and it prints off our list properly. And right now, this time.sleep is kind of a hack. Later I'll go into like using implicit waits, explicit waits. That's some built-in functionality to WebDriver. But for now I'm just going to do a quick just sleep so that it just waits regardless while it loads. So we can watch our program run. If everything goes well, it'll type in our query and then hit the enter button. So we can see it's loading. And there we go, we can see we got our list of elements. So our little flaw here is we can see it did pick up this add. So if we installed an ad blocker, and that's another thing I can show you how you could do, is that you can use arguments to install various extensions and stuff into your before it runs as it's starting up. You can install an ad block or some other extension, but we can see that we got free code camp, programming with Mosh, code evolution. If we look at what printed off, we can see these same things. So our code, our find elements and all that is working. In a lot of cases it's kind of trial and error. You might get a like element not found, stuff like that. I'll show you how to do error handling, but in a lot of cases that's all right. It's just trial and error. You'll try, you'll get a bug, and you'll just fix it over time. So let's comment this out. And now what we want to do is we're basically just going to do simple for loop to compare our code. So we're going to do for index and channel in enumerate, and this is a Python thing, but basically what enumerate lets us do is it pulls out the specific index, and we're going to need that to figure out where exactly our video is ranked at. So what we're going to do is if channel dot text equals channel name, we're going to print video rank position, and we're going to do a comma, and we're going to do index +1. The reason we're doing the +1 is because our arrays are 0 indexed, so we don't want a video, if we're the top rank, we don't want to be rank 0. We're position number 1, so we have to add this 1, and we're just going to break out. If we found our video channel, there's no point continuing to loop through these videos, so we can just break out. So click save, and now let's run this. We'll exit out, and we're going to run through this again and see if our basic rough beginner project, see if it all works as we expect it to. So let's check the results, and we can see that we got position 3. So I think there's something going on with how it's, I don't know if there's like a second ad that's not showing, where it's grabbing both those before the actual video we're looking for. But really, in this case, it's not a big deal. The main point of the tutorial is just to go over kind of some of the basic real-world use cases for Selenium. So we showed how you can go to a URL, how you can grab an element, type for an input bar, how you can click on a button, basic delay, and then how we can pull text, like a text property, from an element and use that in our program. So next up, what we're going to do is just go over some of the more niche use cases, some stuff that not all of you will use all the time, but some people might find it useful. So I'm just going to create a new file, and I'm going to copy and paste some code in here. So I'm just going to basically, I'm not going to run any of this, but I'm just going to kind of walk through it. So the first thing that you might be interested in is what are called options, and then capabilities that you can basically customize based on what you're trying to do when you instantiate your driver. So basically you import these up here like this, and then when you go to create your driver, you can pass them in as parameters, and you can also do like an executable path. So if you didn't have your Chrome driver in your file, you could just pass it around from wherever you have it. But going back up, so let's say if you're making bots, a lot of websites, if you're making a lot of requests, they'll block you based on your IP address. So one thing you can do is create a proxy, and what this will do is basically, instead of your bot showing is coming from your local computer, you could get a proxy address or a proxy server and run it through those. So your requests would show up as coming up from wherever your proxy server is located. You also have a useful one, which is headless mode. So when we were running those, our bot earlier, it popped up and we could see the actual browser being opened up. That can get kind of annoying. If you just want to run something in the background, what you can do is headless mode, and the browser will basically, it'll just be like you have it minimized, kind of, where it doesn't show up. Another argument you can add is disable info bars. So that's like where it says when we ran it and it was saying that Chrome is being controlled by automation. You can get rid of that by passing in this argument. You can do start maximize, which is the window size. Instead of being like a half browser window, you can do it so it's full screen. And you can also disable like extensions. On the other hand, if you want to run an ad block or something to speed up our tests, or just not mess with your results if there's ads in the way for some reason, you can download whatever ad block you like. So like uBlock, you can then put a path file, and then you just pass in that argument like that. Another thing is blocking pop-up notifications. So a lot of those websites now, they'll ask you to subscribe for notifications or whatever. That can be a pain. With automation, with Selenium, it's hard to click out of those or predict when they'll show up. So most of the time I'll just do this little command here, and that prevents those notification pop-ups from appearing. So after that, we have our waits. So in our previous, we just did a time.sleep, which is kind of pretty hacky, and in a lot of cases you probably don't want to do a set number like that. So what this will do is you can import this WebDriver wait, and you can give it a default, so like 10 seconds. And what this will do is it'll wait until an expected condition. So we have here like element to be clickable, but there's a bunch of different options here. So you can do like an alert is present, element located, selected, all sorts of different options there. And basically what this does is like every few milliseconds, I think, it'll basically query, it'll check for this condition, and if the object appears or whatever, then it will select that object. So instead of like in our rank check where we just wait for 10 seconds no matter what, you could do something like wait until this element appears and then you could run it. So it's basically a more efficient way to run your code, so you're not just waiting for a set sleep amount of time. So that's something you can use fairly frequently. Another way to find elements is this different format, which is what we're going to be using quite a bit in our next section on QA testing, which is instead of doing like driver dot find elements by class name, CSS, whatever, you can just do driver.findElement, and you can pass in this, you can create what's called a tuple in Python or in other programming languages, and basically specify, you import this by helper function, and basically you can do by class name, by XPath, by ID, and then you can specify with a string here whatever way you want to identify it, and then you can use it by just doing driver find element, and you use this asterisk, and basically what this does is it just unpacks this tuple. So instead of doing asterisk element, you could just do element 0 and element 1, but that asterisk is basically just a shortcut of that. And then finally we have exceptions. So generally you're going to want to do these instead of just running your code. You don't want your program to crash just blatantly. So what you could do here is in whatever programming language, so Python you have try except, in JavaScript it'd be like try catch. And what you do is you try to find this element, and if it doesn't exist, you can throw off an error, print something off, close down the driver, all sorts of stuff like that. So these are some of the most popular. You have no element exists, an element doesn't have that attribute, or not visible. So basically these are just some common, you're not going to use them every time you make a script, but they're pretty useful in certain situations. So now we're going to transition into how we can use Selenium for QA testing. So let's go back to our slideshow. And basically automated QA testing, it allows us to basically do routine tests of common app functionality. So instead of having people manually do the same things and check, where they can manual testing, a lot of times they can be prone to mistakes after you do the same thing so many times. It's just natural for people to get kind of bored and tired and start making mistakes. So it lets us test stuff like login, the UI, make sure everything's working properly. One way to think about it, as opposed to like unit testing, where unit testing you're basically looking at one small piece of the app and making sure that thing works perfectly. With integration testing, which is what we're doing with Selenium, you're basically seeing how the whole app works together. So in some ways that can be good, in other ways it can be kind of bad. So for example, let's say like a real world example would be car headlights. With integration testing, you'd basically just see, you'd flip the switch and say, does the headlight work, and yes or no. And if it doesn't work, you don't really have a ton of insight into exactly what could be wrong with it. So like unit testing would tell you maybe the light bulb's burnt out, maybe the actual switch inside the car is broken, maybe there's a wire that's loose. Like each component you'd know exactly what's wrong. With integration testing, you get a good broad overview of whether it's working or not, but you don't get as much insight. Another use case is also you can do like load testing. So if you want to see how many users at once your app can handle, you could fire up a bunch of instances of Selenium or whatever test framework we're using and see how many requests your app can handle. If it's got a bottleneck somewhere, that's another good use case. One style we're going to be using to basically organize our tests is what is known as page object model. It's a design pattern that will help organize our test code and reduce code duplication. Basically, we're going to break down a website kind of into the specific pages, and you basically store all of those web elements together in one spot so that if something changes with the UI, you don't have to change your code in 50 different test cases. You can just go to that one spot, update the like CSS class or whatever, and then everything will go back to working properly. So now that we kind of got a quick overview of what exactly QA testing is and what page object model is, let's jump into actually using it for real. So what we're going to be doing is working with Reddit, and we're going to test like logging in, verifying based on our username and password whether we successfully logged in or failed to log in. And then we're also going to basically check if posts are showing up, and then if upvoting is working. So even if you're not really interested in QA testing, it's still good to watch this process because Reddit's a little bit more advanced than the YouTube project in that we have to get a little bit more creative with our selectors. We have to use some XPath and also mess around with some iframe stuff. So this is, whether you're interested in QA testing or not, this is still good for learning Selenium. So first thing we're going to do is go back to our editor, and we're going to basically set up our folder structure. So we're going to create 2 new folders. First one we're going to call test, and the second one we're just going to call pages. And actually we need to pull that out. So inside our test folder, we're going to create 2 files. We're going to call test login.py, and then we're going to create test home.py. And these can be titled whatever you want. You just want to make sure you have test as the first part, test underscore, because that's how our test runner is going to find these files. And then inside pages, we're going to create login.py and home.py. Next, let's start off with our login page. So what we're going to do is from Selenium, we're going to import WebDriver, and then we're also going to bring in this by command, and this will make it easy for us to organize all of our elements and locators and stuff like that. So we're going to create a class, we'll call it authentication, and inside this, up at the top here, we're going to find all of our selectors, but down below we're going to create an init. And what this does is basically just when the class is created, this allows us to pass an argument to it. And what we're going to want to do is pass in this driver to this class. So this is, we'll instantiate it in our test here when we make that, and we'll basically just pass it in as a parameter, and then we can use the driver just like any normal Selenium script. So then beneath that, let's make our login script, which will need to pass a username and a password. And now we can go grab these elements. So go back to Reddit. So let's just go step by step. First thing we're going to need to do is grab this login button. So we're going to click inspect and identify. So as always, let's see, we want to look and see what's the easiest way to work with this, and It's pretty obvious compared to YouTube, where it had nice stuff like search icon and stuff like that. We can see that they've made it pretty tough to kind of identify. So in this case, what we're going to want to do is try to find just a unique one of these classes. So we'll start off with trying this one maybe. So copy that, and then we'll go back, and what we're going to do is just, we'll call it login pop-up button, and that'll be equal to by dot class name, and then we can just paste that in there. So then once we've got that, we can go back and we're going to click on this. And then inside this, the big thing is if we scroll up, or if we look at this itself, we can see that it's an iframe. So this is a big thing. The first time I ran into this, it took me a long time to figure out why my code wouldn't work. So the way Selenium works is an iframe is basically, it's almost like its own nested web page inside another web page. So if you try to click on these buttons without switching into this iframe, it'll throw an error, because it'll basically be looking outside of the iframe for this element. It won't find it and you'll get an error. So this is something that's really important if you're messing around with Selenium in the future. It's something I haven't seen very many tutorials cover. So what we're gonna have to do is identify this iframe by this class, and we'll have to switch the context of our browser. So I'll go over that, but first let's just identify it. So we're just going to call this iframe equals, I'm going to do by class name, and then just paste that in. So then next up, we're going to assume we're going to switch to that. So now we can act like this is just a normal element. So we need to grab our username fields. You can see this one's a little bit easier. We have a nice, pretty simple class name, but you could also use this ID. Actually, we'll use that since that works well. And you could also use, there's different ways to pull in stuff like name and data, stuff like that with XPath. But since in this case we have a nice, easy to use ID, we'll stick with that. So we'll call this login username field. Just do by ID, and we'll paste that in, and then just repeat the process for the password field. And then finally what we're going to need is our sign in button, and we're also going to need, I'll show you in a second, we're going to need a check for a way if our login fails, we want to be able to figure out a way to determine that it failed. So like if we type in just random stuff, click sign in, we can see that we get a little pop-up there. So that's something we can determine based on if this element appears, we can decide that our login failed. But so we also need to grab, kind of getting ahead of ourselves, we need to grab this animated submit button. So we're just going to do login submit button equals class name. So we just need to grab that one last element and also fix this. Save. So we can just do, so by class name, we'll just get this animated error message. And now that we have this, we can So now we have that, we can start using these elements in our code. So first thing we're going to do is do driver.get, do https reddit.com, so just go to the Reddit homepage, and then we're going to grab our login button. So we're going to do login button equals self.driver.find element, and we're going to do this asterisk, so self dot login pop-up button. So if anyone's not familiar with Python, this self just gives us access to these variables up here. So that's all we're doing. So we're just using this self dash login button. And then beneath that, we can click on it. So login button dot click. This will open up that pop-up. And then once we have that pop-up open, this is where the iframe comes into play. We need to capitalize that. Okay, so now this is where this iframe, we have to use it. So we're going to do frame equals driver dot self dot driver find element. I'm just going to do the same thing, self dot iframe, and then we need to do self dot driver dot switch to dot frame, and then we pass it this iframe object, and this switches us back from the outside the main web page to inside this iframe. And from there we can actually interact with those fields. So we're going to do username field equals, same process as always. It's pretty repetitive. Once you get a hang of it, it's just a lot of repeating the same stuff, the same fundamentals. So login username field, and click on it to get inside of it, and then we just put in our send keys. So username dot send keys, and this is where we're going to pass in whatever username we want. So we're going to be doing two different types of tests, where we do one to see if we succeed, and a second one where we'll pass in a fake username and password and check if our, basically it'd be like testing if your error handling works, because you want to verify that people who don't have a correct password can't just log into your app. So we're going to be doing both those inside our test login. So really we can just copy and paste this code because it's going to be a repeat for the password field. Just change this password field. I think it's, yeah, password field, and just repeat that. And then finally underneath here we have to grab our submit button and just click on that to confirm and pass through that information. Finally click. So now we basically have our test code working. We don't have any errors. So now we can go into our test file and actually start running these tests. So inside here we're going to want to import unit test, which is Python's kind of test framework. Do from Selenium import Webdriver. And then finally we're going to from pages dot login import authentication. So this is just importing, we're going inside this folder, going into this file, and grabbing that class we just created. Inside here we're going to call it login test, and we're going to base this class off of a unit test case. Inside this we're going to do a built-in function, which is test function setup. And what this does is every test function we run, we can basically specify some code. So what we're going to do is create our driver here. Set equal to webdriver.chrome. So this is where we create our browser instance for Selenium. And then underneath this, we want to do def tear down. And what this is, and actually we have to make sure that's capitalized. So def tear down. And what this does is when the test is done running, we can specify code here. So in this case, what we want to do is every time when the test is done, we want to close our browser so we don't have a bunch of background browsers running basically. So once we've got that out of the way, now we can actually make our test. So you can name this whatever you want. You just always have to make sure test is the first keyword, and then underscore we can specify behind that. So we're going to do login success, and then below that we can do login failure. So we'll test both cases. Whoops. And this is going to be a good example of why we do that page object model. This will save us a ton of code, because all we have to do is we import this authentication. So we're going to just call it auth page equals authentication, and we pass in our driver. So self.driver, this is where we create it, and then we can bring it into our authentication. And now that we have that created, we can do login. And what this is doing, we can see it's asking for our username and password because we created it. We're basically just running this function here inside our test. So we can call this real username, and we'll call this real password. And then in here, we can basically copy and paste this, and we'll just call it fake username and fake password. So this is basically an example right here of why you take the time to make this extra file and basically create this class object, because instead of having to basically repeat this exact same code twice right here, we can just borrow this functionality and we can use it across different areas of our tests. So if we want to test not just login, but some other, like if we were going to test upvote in our home page, instead of having to rewrite this test login logic, we can just use login as part of that test, and then in addition do our upvote after that. So it basically saves us time and effort across our tests. And if something changes, like if, let's say Reddit, for whatever reason, they don't want people, they change this to something more difficult to use, instead of having to go into 50 different test cases and change that specific login selector, we just have to change it in one spot and all of our tests will work again. So now, one last thing we need to do is go back here, and we can basically do what are called assertions to make sure that everything worked how we wanted it to or predicted it to. We don't really need to do anything for test login success. As long as there's not an error, we're pretty much good. But you could do something like self.assert, and you can see this unit test case gives us a bunch of different stuff. So we could do like equals, contains, there's a bunch of different stuff here. But in this case we could do like a lot of websites, when you log in, they'll have like a URL like facebook.com/login or something, whatever website, and then they redirect you to the main page once you've logged in. So for this you could do something like you'd want to do self.driver. I think current URL, and then you could verify that that's equal to like https reddit.com. So if you don't get redirected after logging in, if the whatever website you're doing the URL doesn't work, you could basically, that test case would fail, and you'd know that something's wrong with your login. So let's comment that out. In the case of our failure, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because we're checking to see if that failure authentication, if it worked, if the pop-up icon thing worked. If we go back, we can see that we want to check if this exists. So what we're going to do is basically grab that element, so we'll just call it failure text, and we're going to set that equal to self.driver.find elements. So we're not going to do just singular, we're going to do plural, and we're going to do auth.page, and then we're going to do dot login error. So this is, we're basically grabbing this login error, which is this right here. This is the basically property of that class that we're grabbing. So we're going to try to find this element and see if it's on the page, and then what we're going to do is self.assert greater than, and then we're going to compare, we're going to do the length of this failure text, and we're going to want to make sure it's greater than 0. So this is like kind of a little trick you can do with Selenium. When find elements, this returns an array. So basically we're looking for one instance of this, and if that array has this one object we're looking for, and it's basically we'll have 1, so the length of that would be 1. So if it's greater than 0, that means our test case passed. That's what we're looking for. So now we can start running these tests. Save that. I'm not going to go too in depth on this because this is, I'm trying to keep it general, but running these tests is more Python specific since we're using unit tests, so it's not going to be as useful for all viewers. But I will just do a quick example of how to run these. So you're going to do python-m, which is a flag that lets us run it as a module, and then you're going to do unit test, and then for our case, since we're doing everything kind of by the defaults, we can just click enter here and it'll run our tests. If you had a different file name or structure for the way you have your stuff named, you could do discover, and then you can kind of specify with flags the format for how your files are set. But if we just do python-unit test, we should see it can run our tests. For whatever reason it didn't run. Must not have looked in the right spot. And I think it's because we didn't create our init.py files. So all we gotta do is inside these folders do 2 underscores, init, and then .py. So create one for test and the pages. And I think if we run this now, it should be able to find it. Yeah, we can see it's running now. So it's just a dumb mistake, but it happens from time to time. So we can see this is basically what'll happen is each of these tests, anything with this test appended to the front, for Python, this unit test framework will go through, it'll run those tests and just do all the stuff that we specified. But and it'll return, basically based on what happens, it'll return whether it passed or failed, and you could use that to determine whether your app's working. So we're just going to click out of that and cancel. We're also going to clean up, we don't need these files. Just clean up our editor, and now we can move on to, so we got kind of a basic our login functionality, and now we're going to move on to our home page, and we're going to do the upvote testing and check if posts are loading properly. So we're just going to kind of repeat what we did before. We're going to import Selenium, that by function again, so that we can identify our web elements. So we're just call this class home, since we're going to be on the home page. And inside this, let's start with our init function again. Do self and our driver. Okay, so now let's go grab those elements. Click out. So first thing we want to do is we can go based on post title. So we got our post object, we can look at this title and we can see we got a class. What else? We might be able to identify based on this. I'm going to show you a trick with XPath of how you can check if you're getting all the proper elements. So if we go in here to our console, we can do var titles equals, and you're going to do an S and an X, and what this will let you do is test XPaths, which you could do a whole video on. They're a little bit complicated sometimes, but what we're going to do is check if we can grab these. So we can see what it is an H3. So with XPath, what we're going to do is a //H3, and then inside this we can do it contains, and then a parentheses. We're going to do at class, and then inside that 2 more commas to identify a string, and then we can paste that. And now if we do titles, we can see we have 28 titles, and we can, if we hover, we can see that we're getting all of those titles right there. So this class name works. That's just a quick way that when I'm testing something out, I'm not for sure if an element will work properly. You can use the console, and then instead of having to run Selenium itself, which takes like, each iteration takes a while because you have to load up your browser. It takes 10 seconds for that to start up, then you have to load the page. So that's a little trick I've learned, to use the Chrome console to quickly check and make sure you have the right identifier. So since we've already written up this XPath, we're just gonna use that. We can copy and paste it. So it's Control C. And if we go back to our editor, what we can do is we'll call that our post titles. I'm going to do by XPath, and it's basically the same thing where we can just paste that in there. And then below that, we also have to make sure by default, when you don't have it loaded up, the view, if you're not logged in, the view will be this. And we're going to want to switch to this classic view, so we want to identify that element as well. So if we click on this right here, it's going to be the second thing we want to identify. So this is going to be, you can just scroll down and let's see. It's kind of trial and error where you have to look at each one, see if you can find something. If we have an oh, here we go. We have an ID. So we're just going to use that. Whenever you can, always use an ID or a CSS tag. And if you can't find anything else, you can always resort to the XPath, which I think for a couple of these we're going to end up having to. But for now, for this element at least, we can use just that ID tag. So we're going to do layout switch equals by ID, and we just paste layout switch in there. So for post titles, we're good. Next thing we're going to want to do is our upvotes. So if we go back and switch this view, we can try to find some way to identify our upvote. So if we click on that, we can see that we really don't have any solid way. Selenium's not good at handling multiple CSS classes, and some of these, they might be shared across classes, so you're not really sure if you're going to get just this upvote. You might also get the downvotes, which you don't want. So what we're going to do here is, to find this button, we're going to use another XPath where we're going to do, probably our best shot is this ID. But you see, the issue here is that each one of these buttons has its own, at the end here, it has its own identifier. So this would cause an error. If you tried to copy this exactly, you'd only get one specific one, and if we refreshed for a different post, it probably wouldn't have the same tag at the end. I'm assuming that's probably the same if we looked at the URL yeah, you can see this thing's based off the URL specifically. So it's identified, has a unique identifying value. So if we just copy and pasted this, the next time in a day or two, when a different post is on the front page, this would come off as broken. So what we're going to do is just grab this first chunk, and with XPath we can, I'll show you how you can basically do a start or end of a element. So we're going to do upvote equals X again, and then we can do, based on what element that is, it's a button. So we're going to do slash slash button, and then we're going to kind of repeat what we just did, where we do contains, and we're going to do ID, and we're going to do, just paste in this upvote -t3. And what this will basically do is any element that contains upvote in this start thing, it will, the rest of it doesn't matter. As long as it has this first part, it contains that, it'll pull out everything. So if we click enter and then print off, whoops, our upvotes, we can see we have 28 of these upvotes here. So if we'd use a different element, you can see we're only getting the upvote, not the downvote. If we'd gone by just the class, I'm assuming that they'd be shared across, since they're basically the same icon, just a little bit different. We'd end up getting probably all these, and we wouldn't get the element we wanted. So if we scroll up, we can paste this again. And basically, for a lot of these more social media sites, they obviously don't want bots manipulating the results, so that's why you have to kind of get more creative with this, as opposed to just getting convenient ID tags. Like, you can look at how, like, I'm assuming Reddit's probably using something to mangle these class names so that they're not human readable. That would be just my guess, because they probably are trying to combat bots just due to various factors. So let's go back, we'll do upvote button equals, do by XPath, and we'll paste that in. So the last element we need is basically to verify that we've pressed this button. So if we go back, basically when you click on this, we can see, if we go to this button, we can see it has a value of pressed as false. So I did this earlier where I checked that if I'm logged in and you press on this, basically what happens is this factor, this is one thing that changes, is that this changes to false, or this changes from false to true. So basically that's a way that we can identify for our test that we've actually pressed on this. We can verify that an element with this set to true exists on the page, and we can use that then to verify our upvote worked, that the functionality works on the website. So I'm just going to paste in this XPath. It's a little bit more complicated than the ones we used before, and we're just going to do upvote button press. Basically you can see, so you can pull off with XPath. The nice thing about it is you can do more than just ID. You can do basically, it's like in this example we did aria pressed. So we grab pretty much any of these values. You could do at class, at data click ID, at ID, pretty much any of those attributes you can use with XPath to identify. So I just did, I want to make sure it's got that value pressed to true, and I reuse this value from up here. So we want to make sure it's a button, and I want to make sure the value is true, because otherwise if like if you set this to false, it would grab all the elements that aren't upvoted by your bot, or your in this case our test bot. So now that we have our items identified, we can make our functions. So first we're going to do def post loaded, do self, and what we're going to do is do self.driver.get and go to the Reddit homepage, and then we're going to grab the layout button and set that equal to that element we found earlier. So find, whoops, element, and then we're just going to do self dot layout switch. I can't type lay out. Oh my god. Brain froze up. Alright. So then the layout button dot click. And basically that's all we have to do for this test, because once we run this and basically load up that home page and switch the view, the rest will check if those elements exist inside our test. And then for our upvote, we're actually not going to create the method itself here, because we need to borrow this login. We need to be logged in before we can actually do our upvote. So we're going to basically just borrow these elements from this class and create the test case. Most of the logic inside the test. It's probably not exactly best practice, but in this situation it's probably the best we can do. So let's save this and we'll go to our test home, import unit test. Let's do a class home test, and then we need to import this, so unit test dot test case. We also need to do from Selenium import Webdriver. So now in here we can, we'll just copy this stuff, basically stays the same. So we're just going to copy that aspect. And now we'll start off with test upvote. And what we're going to do is do from pages dot login import authentication, and then from pages dot home import our home class. So for testing our upvote function, we can do home page equals home self dot driver, and then for our auth page, we can do it's equal to authentication and passing that driver again. So all we're going to be using our home page for is basically to grab those elements, and our auth page we're going to do auth page dot login, and we have to make sure we need our username, so let's do real username, real password, and then basically from there what you'd want to do is we do self.driver, we find our upvote button, so upvote button equals self.driver.find element, and we'd set that equal to homepage dot upvote button. So we're just grabbing this element from here, and then we're going to click on it, and then we can verify that that thing has been upvoted. So we're going to do upvoted button success equals self.driver.find element, and we're going to do upvote button press. And actually we need to do that same trick from before where we do elements list, and then we can do self.assert greater, and we can just do the same thing where we do length of upvoted button success is greater than 0. So basically if we successfully log in and upvote this thing, we'll have one, the length of this will be 1 because we have that one upvoted element, and that will pass. So we can save that. Now let's move on to our test post loading. This will be a little bit simpler since we don't have to basically mix and match stuff. We don't need to be logged in to check if our post loaded, so we can just do home page equals home and pass in our driver, and then we just do home page dot post loaded, and then finally we'll find our posts, which are equal to self.driver find elements, and we'll just do homepage dot post titles, and we can do the same thing where self dot assert greater than. In this example, you could do an exact number where I think by default it loads like 28. Or you can just do greater than 0 to make sure any of the posts loaded. So we'll just do greater than 0. Just keep it simple and make sure everything's loaded based on that. Alright, as far as testing goes, that's basically all I'm going to cover, because if I go any more in depth, it's basically just going to be Python specific stuff. And I want this video to be as general as possible so it can help as many people as possible regardless of what programming language you use. So I was going to end the video here. I even updated my editor so the icons and all that's a little bit different, if you notice that. But I think I'm going to extend. I'm going to go over a few more advanced Selenium topics that personally took me quite a bit of Googling and looking at Stack Overflow to solve some of these problems. So if you want to keep watching, I'm going to cover some topics that'll probably save you a couple hours if you run into them on your own. So what I'm going to cover is how to make profiles so that you can stay logged in. So that's useful for both testing and making bots. Like for example here, every time we run a test, we have to log in individually. So if we want to test upvotes or various other features, we have to log in every time. And if you're making bots, that would also be something that you don't want to do, because if your bot logs in 10 times in an hour, it's probably going to trigger something with either Twitter or Reddit or Facebook, whatever you're building the bot for, and they might ban your account. So you don't want that to happen. So what we're going to do is cover how to make profiles so you can maintain login sessions. I'm also going to do how you can screenshot error pages and also build action chains for basically creating fine-tuned control. So an example of what you can do with action chains is basically simulate human mouse movements with Selenium, which I'll show you exactly what's going on in a little bit. But first, what we're going to do is create some profiles. So if we head over to Chrome, we can look and basically see up here is what we'd call a profile, and I named it test profile. So if you go to manage people, you can basically see you have a default profile, which is when you install Chrome, it creates that automatically. And then you can create multiple here. If you do add person, you can create your own profile. Basically what happens if you use Selenium just by default, what happens is every time it creates the browser, you're basically using a browser's guest. So every time you run your bot, you open up a fresh browser with no cookies, no login stuff, and you're just running a fresh Chrome installation basically. So what we want to do is be able to use these profiles with Selenium. So once you've created add a person, you can just do this stuff, create a shortcut, but you're going to want to click add. What that will do is inside this file here, which is, it'll be inside users, and then whatever user account you're using, and app data. What you want to make sure you do is show hidden files too, so you can see this app data file. And if you go, keep clicking through to Google, Chrome, and then inside this you have user data, you can see that you have your default profile here, and then down lower you have profile 1. So I believe that basically regardless what you name this, like I called this test profile, but it gets saved as profile 1 in here, and if you create another one, it'll be profile 2. So what you're going to want to do is basically copy this URL path. So we're going to click back to our editor. And what we're going to want to do is create a new file. Let's call it profiles.py. And what we can do is essentially, when we instantiate our browser, we went over those arguments and stuff earlier, we can then use those profiles by pointing to that path. So what we're going to do is we're going to do from Selenium import WebDriver, and what we're going to do is also from selenium.webdriver.chrome, we're going to do options and then import options. So we're going to create our options object, and then inside this what we're going to do is options.addArgument, and what we're going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste this path, so it's a string basically. And grab that. So you can see I just grabbed this little file here inside here. The only thing you need to change, you can basically use the same thing here. The only thing that'll change for you is whatever your user account you're using on Windows or whatever. That will be the only difference there. So then underneath this, we can do options.addArgument, and we're going to add a second one, which we're going to do --profile-directory, and we're going to set that equal to profile1. And if you just wanted to use your default, instead of doing profile1 in here, you could delete that and just do the default. So essentially just inside this, if you have multiple, so you can use default, profile1, profile2, whichever one you want to use, you're just going to specify that here. And then what this will allow us to do is when we create our driver, we can just do WebDriver.chrome, and we're going to do options equals options. So we're basically just passing this, and the way to think about this is when you use Chrome, what's going on is when you click like on down below where the Chrome icon is or whatever on your shortcut, it's using chrome.exe, so it's running this executable Chrome file, and then what this does, it's basically the same thing, but we're passing this in, we're passing these arguments into the chrome.exe thing. So that will allow us to then, if we just run this, we can do driver.get https reddit.com. And what you want to make sure, I'll show you how to get around this little bit of a, it's a kind of a, not a bug, but it's just an aspect of Selenium, is you need to make sure, the way we're using it now, is you have to make sure you have all your open Chrome profiles or whatever windows closed before you run this. Otherwise, basically, it'll say you have an error where, because this file is being used by another instance, it'll say that it's basically got the file locked and we can't use it. So we're just going to do python profiles.py, and if everything works properly, let's see here. Whoops, that's a dumb mistake. I accidentally passed in this thing rather than that. So save that again. If we run this now, what we should see is it'll open up with it properly logged in. So we can see that even though we're using Chrome, it says it's being controlled, we're still logged in because we're using this profile rather than that guest profile. So that's basically just a summary, a quick, it's pretty easy to use, but that'll show you how you can use login sessions in between running your scripts. So to get around, like I said, in a lot of cases, you're gonna wanna have your own Chrome running. You don't wanna have to close out of your browser just to run Selenium. So to get around this issue where we're basically using the same folder, it's pretty simple actually. All you'd have to do is basically copy this folder. So you could just do click, copy it, and paste it, and you could create like user data 2 or whatever you want to name this thing. And then you can you could name it user data Selenium, and then you could use this specifically for Selenium. So you have the second user data file, and you would just change this to user data Selenium. And what that would basically allow you to do is, instead of having to try to use the same folder which gets locked so it can't be accessed while you have it open in another window, you can just use a second copy of this folder and grab that profile data from there. So that's how you solve that issue of simultaneous access to that folder. So it's a pretty simple fix, but that's something you have to. It took me a long time to figure that out, where one, just how to do this. There's not a lot, like in the documentation, there's really nothing covering how to use these arguments to use sessions and stuff, and I had to dig quite a bit to find why I wasn't able to have like multiple windows open at the same time. Alright, so next up I'm going to show you how to upload files with Selenium and also take screenshots. So we're just going to create another file and call it file upload.py. From here we're just going to do the standard import Selenium and also import time speed delay. And basically all I did here is I googled file upload test, and what we can do here is, by default with Selenium you can't, because the browser, if you click choose file here, it opens up this native file explorer object which we can't interact with in Selenium. So what we have to do is find this file upload element, and once we found it we can actually send the name of the file. We can type in the name of the file. So it's kind of non-intuitive. We can't just use what we'd use as a human, but we can test uploading files. So inside this we're going to create our driver, and then we're not going to do anything. Whoops, we got space there. We're not going to do any arguments or anything. We're just going to use the standard driver, and then here we're going to get that URL and paste that. Make it a string, and then we can do find element by name, and I made this pretty simple for us here. It's just input name user file, so we can just paste that, make it a string again, and then we're going to chain this. We're going to do send keys, and what we're going to want to do is you can use whatever file you want. I'm just going to use an image I already have. So you want to make sure you put the full path that it's going to type in there. And then next what you're going to do is, I'm not going to submit it, but you do basically driver dot find element, and you just do element name or whatever, and then you just click your submit button. So we're not going to do this part, but what you do is basically you'd find this element here and you just click on it, but I'm not going to go through that process. And then to verify that we've actually uploaded it, we're going to do driver.get screenshot. Actually, the reason we're not getting the autocomplete is because we're doing that wrong. So now we got, okay, so get screenshot, so as PNG, and we'll make sure this is find element by name. Alright, Driver.getScreenshot as PNG, and then you can name this whatever you want. So I'm just going to call it test.png, and we'll also just do a sleep here. Do that for 5 seconds, and then we'll close our browser. So if we run this, hopefully everything works. We're going to Python file upload.py, and we'll run this thing and see what happens. So we can see here it types right in there. Basically that's the equivalent of choosing it automatically from over there, and then we can just click the send file there. So it's pretty simple. You just have to find, it's basically like everything we've done with Selenium, where you just have to find the element and then interact with it how you normally would, and it's basically all there is to it. It's not too complicated. What is complicated is apparently screenshots, because I messed that up. What this should be, instead of get screenshot, it should be save screenshot. So we just let's rerun this and verify that works. And once that's done, it'll save our screenshot right in the same directory. So we can see here that we have our screenshot.png. We can verify that works. So what that's useful for, you can do it for stuff like this. You can also use it if we go back to our test cases. You can do stuff like with try excepts, or like whatever language you're using. If you had like if the element doesn't exist, or you get some various error, you could pass off that error as the test failing, and you could also, if you wanted, get a screenshot so you can kind of get a visual look at exactly what's going wrong when you get that error. So that's what screenshots can be pretty useful for, stuff like that. The last thing we're going to be taking a look at is what are called action chains. So we're just going to create a file and call it ac.py, and basically what these are is they let you, like I said earlier, kind of fine-tune what you can do with elements. So as we'll see, you can do like drag and drop stuff, you can type with it, and you can basically compose them into, obviously would be a chain. So we're going to do import action chains, and we need first our driver equals Webdriver dot Chrome, and then we can create an action. Let's call actions equal action chain, and then what we can do is pass our driver object. So then once we have this, what we can do is it gives us all these options off of this. So if we look, we can see we got click. Let's just go up to the top. So you can see you have click and hold. You can do context click. So if you wanted to do, if you had like a custom, some apps that have like a right click, it has like a custom menu option, so you could test that with this. You can do double clicks, drag and drop, all these various things, move by offset, pause, and then the big thing is perform. So basically what you can do is you could do, you'd pass in your element, so you could do dot click, and then you do your element, and then you could do dot send keys, and then you could do, so you could just add on all these different things, and then finally you could do perform, and then do them all in a sequence. So rather than going through all this, I just want to show you the main ideas behind it. So I'm just going to paste in a couple code examples. So I'm going to delete this, and so this would be example if you had like a nested menu that you wanted to test. So if you had drop downs and stuff, you could find your menu element, and you'd find that by the nav. You'd find the sub menu, and then you could create this chain. You'd pass in your driver object, you'd move to the menu element, you'd click on it, that would open up the submenu, you'd perform that, and then basically you can just kind of navigate throughout this submenu. And this would be kind of a code example. You can either do it like this, where you chain them all together, or you can also, for readability, you can do it step by step like this. So either way, like this with one line chain, or doing it like this, they both work the same way. And finally, a really advanced use case which I personally made for not the best or most pure intentions is that I made, let's paste it in here. The code, it'll show up as broken because I don't have all of it in there, but basically what I wanted to do was, there's services out there that can kind of detect bots. By default, Selenium, when you move to an element, it's like a straight shot. So if I wanted to move to this element here, it would go straight to it, and it'd do it basically instantly, which you can detect in various ways. So what I wanted to do was kind of emulate human mouse movement. Like when you're using it as a human, you don't move in a straight line. You might curve a little bit. You go a little bit slow. So what I basically did was I used various properties. So I had to pass in a web element. I'd find the location with pixels, and then I would calculate where the current mouse position is with this custom JavaScript function. I would then basically divide that into increments, the distance from the current mouse location to the element that I want to target, like a button or menu, whatever. And then I would add in some randomization, so it would give it a little bit of a curve. And then using this action chain, I can do move by offset. So I'd basically move a set number every increment through this loop. I would do a set amount where that mouse would move just a small number of pixels, and you'd perform, and then you'd create. And then because of the randomization, sometimes it'd be off. You can do another action chain where it will just move it, the last part, it'll move it a couple pixels directly to the element. So basically, this would be a more advanced use case, but when you want to fine-tune things, and 99% of the time, you're probably not going to need to use an action chain. You're not going to want to have to worry about it, especially for testing. If you're doing testing, you really don't need to mess around with it in that case. But you can see here, you can do some really advanced kind of feature stuff, or customization of the actions, how it works and stuff like that. So this is a personal example of how I've used action chains for my own bots and stuff like that. But that's basically everything I wanted to cover for this tutorial. Just kind of a basic introduction to Selenium to start. Then we touched on QA testing and various stuff like that. And finally we ended up with some more advanced stuff. So I just kind of wanted to do like a 80-20 rule kind of thing, where for the majority of use cases, you're going to know enough now to do or build whatever you want to do, whether it's a bot or testing an application. You pretty much know the core concepts of elements, how to find them, how to identify them, and then how to interact with them. If you want more information on QA testing as a potential career or something like that, there's a lot of good resources online, so you really just need to go to Google to check that out. And if you're interested in more of my content, you can check out my channel. I have stuff on Selenium, various projects, and also React.js, Python, stuff like that. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit like and also subscribe. Thanks for watching.